20% of the world's petroleum liquids moves through one narrow strip of water, and Washington just turned the entrance to Iran into a military checkpoint. That is the cleanest way to understand what changed in the Strait of Hormuz. But there is a critical update you need before anybody starts making predictions about $5 gasoline or buying every oil stock on the screen. On July 13th, President Trump announced that the United States was reinstating a naval blockade on vessels entering or leaving Iranian ports and proposed charging ships passing through the strait at the rate of 20% on all cargo shipped. One day later, on July 14th, he dropped that fee proposal and said Gulf nations would compensate the United States through trade and investment agreements instead. The toll booth disappeared from the official plan, but the blockade did not, and neither did the military risk, the attacks on commercial shipping, or the uncertainty surrounding one of the most important energy corridors on Earth. By July 17th, U.S. strikes against targets in Iran were continuing, and the blockade of Iranian ports remained in effect. That correction matters because oil markets do not trade only on what ultimately becomes law. They trade on what could happen next. And for roughly 24 hours, the world's largest military power had floated the idea of placing a 20% charge on cargo moving through an international waterway. Even after the fee was withdrawn, shipping. Companies, insurers, oil traders, refiners, airlines, trucking fleets, farmers, and consumers were left staring at the same uncomfortable question. How much more dangerous and expensive is it to move energy out of the Persian Gulf now? The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that approximately 20 million barrels per day moved through Hormuz in 2024, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption and more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade. This is not some obscure channel that can be replaced by sending a few extra trucks down another highway. It is an artery for the global economy. And here is where the story reaches your neighborhood long before most people expect it to. You may never buy a barrel of Iranian crude. Your local refinery may not process a single drop from Iran. The United States may be producing more oil than any other nation. None of that isolates an American driver from a global price shock, because crude is traded in a connected worldwide market, and gasoline prices in the United States tend to follow Brent, the international benchmark, more closely than the domestic WTI benchmark. When overseas supply becomes harder or riskier to move, buyers compete for barrels from somewhere else. European refiners bid for Atlantic barrels. Asian buyers search for replacements. Tankers reroute. Insurance premiums rise. Traders add a geopolitical risk premium, American crude that might otherwise remain available to domestic. Buyers becomes more valuable abroad, and the price adjustment travels through the entire system. I'm Kunal, the person behind failed finance here in the United States, and this is one of those moments when a foreign policy headline can quietly become a household budget story. The market's initial reaction was immediate. Brent gained 9.6% in the session following the renewed confrontation and reached roughly $83.30 per barrel. Prices moved above $86 and briefly crossed $87 as the blockade, and new attacks deepened supply concerns. By the July 15th close, the EIA's daily snapshot placed WTI at $80.73 and Brent at $83.08, while the average U.S. price for regular gasoline stood at $3.94 per gallon and diesel at $5.01. Those figures can change quickly, but the direction of the shock was clear. Notice what did not happen. Oil did not immediately explode to $150. That is because the market is not pricing a complete and permanent shutdown of Hormuz. It is pricing a probability. Distribution. Some Iranian exports may be blocked. Some non-Iranian ships may continue moving. Some vessels may accept military escorts. Others may refuse. Gulf producers may use pipelines that bypass part of the strait. Governments may release reserves. Demand may weaken as high prices force households and businesses to consume less. Diplomacy could return. Or the conflict could widen. Every barrel price you see is the market's constantly changing estimate of those competing outcomes. That is why a blockade does not create one guaranteed gas price target. It creates a wider range of possible outcomes. And the longer uncertainty survives, the more expensive that uncertainty becomes. The first place most Americans notice it is the gas station, but pump prices do not reset at the exact second Brent moves. Crude must be purchased, transported, refined, blended, distributed, and delivered into regional markets. A commonly used EIA guideline says that a $1 change in crude can eventually translate into roughly 2.4 cents per gallon at the pump, meaning a sustained $10 increase in oil can add about 24 cents to gasoline. Historically, around half of the adjustment may appear within the first 2 weeks, and most of it within about 4 weeks, although refinery outages, inventories, seasonal fuel blends, local taxes, distribution constraints, and profit margins can make the actual result larger or smaller. So if Brent rises from the low 80s and remains near $90, the basic crude pass-through alone could add another 15 to 25 cents per gallon from current levels. If Brent spends weeks near $100, the crude component could add roughly 40 cents compared with an $83 starting point, before accounting for refinery margins or regional shortages. That is not a promise or a precise forecast. It is a sensitivity estimate. If oil spikes for 2 days and diplomacy quickly restores confidence, much of the move may disappear before the full increase reaches every station. If the disruption lasts for months, the cumulative damage becomes harder to hide. And because the national average was already sitting near $3.94 on July 15th, gasoline does not need a historic oil spike to move back above $4 nationally. It needs only a modest sustained increase to work through wholesale and retail channels. Now imagine a household in suburban Arizona, Texas, Ohio, or Georgia using 80 gallons of gasoline per month between 2 vehicles. A 50-cent increase costs another $40 monthly. That may not sound catastrophic to a high-income investor watching energy stocks move on a trading platform, but to a family already balancing rent, daycare, insurance, utilities, groceries, and credit card payments, $40 is not an abstract macroeconomic number. It may be a prescription, a school activity, part of the electric bill, or the amount that was supposed to go into savings. Families in rural communities can face a heavier burden because driving is not optional and distances are longer. Gig workers get squeezed because fuel is a direct operating expense. Small contractors pay more to move tools and crews. Home health workers, delivery drivers, and hourly employees cannot always work remotely. The economic pain is uneven, and that is why an oil shock can appear manageable in national GDP data while feeling severe at the kitchen table. Gasoline is only the visible layer. Diesel is where the broader chain reaction gains strength. Diesel powers the trucks moving food from processors to warehouses, warehouses to distribution centers, and distribution centers to grocery stores. It powers farm equipment, construction machinery, delivery fleets, and parts of the rail system. Refrigerated products require energy during storage and transport. Packaging depends on petroleum-based materials. Fertilizer production and agricultural operations are energy-intensive. When these costs rise, companies have 3 choices: absorb them and accept lower margins, reduce other expenses, or pass some portion to customers. Most businesses use a combination of all 3. That is how an oil shock becomes a grocery bill. It does not mean every carton of eggs jumps 10% the same week oil rises. Retail food prices depend on labor, rent, processing, packaging, farm commodities, competition, spoilage, and marketing, not just transportation. USDA research emphasizes that processing and retailing costs often matter more than the farm value of the food itself. But higher energy costs touch many of those stages simultaneously, and the farther a product travels, the more sensitive it can be to fuel. We already saw evidence of that pressure earlier in the conflict. In May, producer prices for diesel rose 15.7% in a single month. Transportation and warehousing services increased 2.6%, and transportation and warehousing prices were 14.2%, higher than a year earlier. Those are costs arriving upstream before the full impact necessarily reaches a consumer walking through a supermarket. Then June provided a real-world demonstration of the reverse mechanism. A temporary ceasefire pushed gasoline prices down 9.7% for the month, helping the overall consumer price index fall 0.4%. Headline inflation slowed to 3.5% year over year, while core inflation, excluding food and energy, was unchanged for the month and stood at 2.6% annually. That looked like relief. But the renewed blockade arrived in July, after the June inflation data were collected. If oil and gasoline remain elevated, the relief shown in that report could prove temporary, and later inflation reports may begin reflecting the reversal. This is the chain reaction people miss. Oil affects gasoline and diesel. Gasoline and diesel affect household cash flow and business costs. Business costs influence transportation, food, travel, manufacturing, and services. Those price pressures influence inflation data and inflation expectations, and inflation influences what the Federal Reserve is willing to do with interest rates. The Fed's current target range is 3.5 to 3.75%, and its next scheduled meeting concludes on July 29th. At the June meeting, officials kept rates unchanged and explicitly acknowledged that Middle East supply shocks were contributing to elevated inflation. But higher oil does not automatically produce a Fed rate hike. The Fed knows monetary policy works with a lag. Raising rates cannot create crude oil, reopen a shipping lane, repair a damaged port, or persuade a tanker captain to accept a dangerous route. If officials believe the energy increase will reverse quickly, they may look through the first-round rise in headline inflation. The problem begins when the shock lasts long enough to create second-round effects. Businesses raise prices outside the energy sector. Workers seek higher wages to compensate for living costs. Consumers and companies begin assuming inflation will remain high. Bond investors demand higher yields. At that point, a temporary oil shock can become a persistent inflation problem, and the Fed may delay rate cuts, hold restrictive policy longer, or consider another increase if expectations begin moving away from its target. Federal Reserve officials have recently described that exact dilemma. Responding too aggressively could damage employment after the shock fades, but ignoring a prolonged shock could allow inflation expectations to become unanchored. That decision reaches well beyond Wall Street. A longer period of elevated rates can keep mortgages expensive, raise auto loan payments, maintain pressure on credit card APRs, reduce housing affordability, and make business financing harder. Higher Treasury yields can also pressure stock valuations, especially companies whose profits are expected far in the future. So the person who says, "I drive an electric vehicle, oil prices do not affect me," may still feel the shock through airfare, delivery fees, grocery prices, borrowing costs, market volatility, and the value of a retirement account. This is how a conflict thousands of miles away becomes a monthly payment in America. Who benefits? The easy answer is energy stocks and domestic producers, but the easy answer is incomplete. Companies selling unhedged crude at higher prices can generate more revenue and free cash flow if their production costs remain controlled. Firms with strong reserves, manageable debt, disciplined capital spending, and access to pipelines may be positioned better than highly leveraged operators. Oilfield service companies can eventually benefit if producers increase drilling, but that requires management teams to believe high prices will last. Midstream companies may benefit from higher volumes, although many operate more like toll roads and have limited direct exposure to the commodity price. Refiners can benefit when gasoline and diesel prices rise faster than crude, but they can be squeezed when feedstock costs rise faster than the products they sell. An energy label does not guarantee an energy windfall. The losers appear easier to identify. Airlines face higher jet fuel costs. Trucking companies face diesel pressure. Manufacturers using petrochemicals pay more for inputs. Restaurants and retailers can experience weaker discretionary spending as households redirect cash toward transportation. Yet even here, the details matter. Airlines with strong pricing power, modern fuel-efficient fleets, effective hedges, and healthy balance sheets may survive better than competitors. A tanker owner could earn higher charter rates because ships are scarce and routes are longer, even while the companies paying to move cargo suffer. Certain shipping businesses can benefit from disruption while their customers lose. Markets punish lazy categories. They reward investors who examine how. Revenue, Expenses, contracts, debt, and timing interact. That brings us to the most dangerous temptation in this entire story: buying after the headline because the direction seems obvious. Warren Buffett made that mistake in 2008. Berkshire dramatically expanded its ConocoPhillips investment when oil and gas prices were near their peak. Buffett later called it a major mistake and acknowledged that the timing cost Berkshire several $billion. His long-term belief that oil could become more valuable did not rescue a purchase made at the wrong price at the wrong moment. That lesson belongs at the center of failed finance. You can correctly identify a geopolitical crisis, correctly believe oil supply is threatened, correctly expect energy companies to report stronger cash flow, and still lose money because the market priced those facts before you arrived. A great business purchased at an extreme valuation can become a painful investment. A weak producer with too much debt can use higher oil revenue merely to repair its balance sheet while shareholders receive little. A company may have hedged most of its production at lower prices and therefore miss the immediate upside. Management may respond to one strong quarter by overspending on drilling and destroying long-term returns. This is educational analysis, not a personalized instruction to buy or sell a security, because your financial position, time horizon, taxes, risk tolerance, and existing exposure matter more than any dramatic headline. The question is not whether oil is moving. It is whether the cash flow you are purchasing is durable, what price you are paying for it, and what happens if diplomacy causes crude to fall $15 before your trade settles emotionally. If you are seeing gas prices change where you live, put your state and the current price in the comments. That gives us a real map of how quickly this shock is spreading across American communities. And if you value finance analysis, that connects military headlines to household budgets instead of simply yelling, "Buy oil, follow failed finance," because the real edge begins with separating companies that merely wear an energy label from businesses whose cash flow truly improves when oil stays high. And that separation starts with PART2, the first filter. What does the company actually sell, and how directly does the price of that product respond to the Hormuz disruption? An upstream producer sells crude oil and natural gas, so higher realized commodity prices can flow into revenue relatively quickly. A refiner buys crude and sells gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, which means its result depends on the spread between input and output prices. A pipeline operator generally earns fees for transporting or storing energy, creating a business that may be more dependent on volumes and contracts than on the daily oil quote. An oilfield service company sells equipment, labor, drilling technology, and expertise to producers, so it normally needs a sustained increase in exploration budgets before the geopolitical event becomes stronger earnings. An integrated major combines several of these operations, meaning strength in one division can be offset by weakness in another. If you cannot explain which part of the energy chain produces a company's profit, you are not analyzing an investment. You are reacting to a ticker symbol. The second filter is the company's break-even price. Imagine two producers selling oil at $85. Producer A can fund operations and maintain production at $50 per barrel, carries modest debt, and returns excess cash to shareholders. Producer B requires $75, has major debt maturities approaching, and needs constant drilling merely to prevent production from declining. Both may rally during an oil shock, but they are not the same business. The first company possesses resilience. The second has received temporary oxygen. When crude drops, the market may take that oxygen away faster than most investors expect. Look at operating costs, transportation discounts, royalty expenses, production taxes, capital requirements, decline rates, and debt. Do not stop at revenue growth. Third, examine hedging. Producers sometimes lock in future selling prices using swaps, futures, or collars. Hedging can protect cash flow when oil collapses, but it can also limit upside when crude spikes. A producer may announce record market prices while realizing far less because most of its output was sold forward months earlier. The headline says winner. The financial statements reveal something more complicated. Fourth, study capital discipline. Oil booms have a history of convincing executives that high prices will last forever. Companies borrow, acquire expensive assets, expand drilling, and chase production growth. When the cycle turns, shareholders discover that record revenue financed mediocre projects. The stronger operator asks whether a new well generates attractive returns at conservative prices, not whether it works only with $90 crude. That is the modern application of Buffett's ConocoPhillips lesson. Being right about the commodity's importance is not enough when the price already assumes a perfect future. The fifth filter is duration. A stock market may capitalize one strong quarter as if it will continue for 5 years. Your job is to separate a temporary risk premium from a structural supply shortage. One clue comes from the futures curve. If immediate oil prices rise sharply while contracts several years ahead move far less, traders are saying the shortage is serious now but may not last. That condition, commonly described as backwardation, rewards companies able to sell unhedged barrels immediately, but warns investors against assuming today's price will remain permanent. If longer-dated prices also rise substantially, the market is signaling concern about lasting damage to production, capacity, infrastructure, inventories, or trade routes. You do not need to become a professional futures trader to use this information. You simply need to stop treating one spot price as a permanent economic law. The United States has an important advantage it did not possess during the oil crises of the 1970s. It is now the world's largest crude producer. U.S. output averaged a record 13.6 million barrels per day in 2025, and the EIA's July forecast projected about 13.8 million barrels per day in 2026. That supports domestic energy companies and makes the broader American economy less vulnerable than many foreign oil importers. It does not mean U.S. production can instantly replace disrupted Gulf supply. Shale producers need permits, crews, equipment, pipeline capacity, sand, water, financing, and confidence that prices will remain high long enough to justify the investment. Existing wells also decline rapidly, so part of new drilling replaces lost production rather than creating net growth. In a Dallas Fed industry survey conducted during the earlier phase of the conflict, 3/4 of respondents expected the U.S. production response by the end of 2026 to be zero or less than 250,000 barrels per day. That is useful supply, but it is small beside the approximately 20 million barrels that normally move through Hormuz each day. This is why drill more can be a long-term strategy without being an immediate cure for next week's gasoline price. There are pipelines capable of bypassing the strait, especially Saudi Arabia's east-west system and the UAE route to Fujairah, but the EIA estimates effective unused bypass capacity at roughly 2.6 million barrels per day. Helpful? Absolutely. A substitute for the entire waterway? Not remotely. Watch physical flows, not political slogans. How many tankers are crossing? How many are waiting? Are ships willing to join U.S.-guided convoys? Are insurance companies covering the voyages? Are attacks becoming more frequent? Are export terminals operating? As of July 14th, the International Maritime Organization listed 56 confirmed incidents around Hormuz and the broader Middle East maritime zone during the conflict. A government can declare a route open, but if ship owners, crews, charterers, and insurers decide the risk is unacceptable, effective capacity remains restricted. Safety decisions become supply decisions, and supply decisions become price decisions. This is also why the abandoned 20% fee is no longer the central economic issue. The market has replaced the official toll with an unofficial one. War risk insurance, delayed cargoes, escort requirements, rerouting, higher charter rates, crew compensation, financing costs, and the possibility of losing a vessel. Even when no government collects a fee, somebody pays for the risk, and that cost eventually moves through the cargo's final selling price. Now consider airlines. Jet fuel is not a small expense that management can casually absorb. Before the renewed escalation, IATA estimated that the Middle East conflict and high fuel prices had lifted jet fuel to more than 30% of airline operating expenses in 2026 and cut expected industry profitability roughly in half compared with earlier assumptions. An airline may try to raise fares, reduce less profitable routes, add fuel surcharges, delay expansion, or squeeze other costs. Whether it succeeds depends on demand. A carrier serving business travelers and wealthy. International customers may possess more pricing power than a budget airline competing for price-sensitive families. A company with newer aircraft may burn less fuel per seat. A carrier with a strong balance sheet can survive temporary pain. A heavily indebted company refinancing at elevated rates faces fuel pressure and interest pressure at the same time. That is why buying or shorting the entire airline sector based on one oil headline can fail. The weak may become weaker, but the strong can. Gain market share when competitors retreat. Shipping requires the same nuance. Container companies and businesses paying to transport goods can suffer from rising fuel, insurance, and rerouting costs. Tanker owners, however, may benefit when disruptions increase voyage distances and remove ships from available supply. If a tanker takes longer to complete each trip, the effective fleet becomes tighter and charter rates can rise. But a higher rate is not free profit when the vessel faces attack. Insurance exclusions, crew concerns, port restrictions, and possible physical loss. The investor has to distinguish the owner of the ship, the charterer hiring it, the producer loading it, the insurer covering it, and the customer waiting for the cargo. All five may experience the same crisis differently. Refiners deserve special attention because gasoline prices can rise even when crude stops climbing. U.S. gasoline inventories were already below normal earlier in the summer, and refinery utilization had been high. When inventories are tight, a refinery outage or regional logistics problem can widen the spread between crude and gasoline. That is why California, the Pacific Northwest, and parts of the East Coast may experience different outcomes from Texas or the Central Gulf Coast. Taxes, fuel specifications, pipeline access, refinery capacity, and local inventories matter. A national average hides regional stress. If your local gasoline price has already crossed $4.50 while somebody in another state is paying $3.50, both numbers can be accurate. The market is national, but the final mile is local. That brings us to the three scenarios I would use instead of pretending one prediction is certain. Scenario 1 is rapid de-escalation. Attacks decline, negotiations resume, non-Iranian tanker traffic normalizes, insurance becomes available, and markets conclude that the blockade will remain narrowly focused on Iranian cargo. Under that outcome, the geopolitical premium can fade quickly. Brent could retreat toward the levels assumed before the latest fighting, wholesale gasoline could soften, and retail prices might follow with a lag. Remember the rockets and feathers problem. Gas stations often raise prices rapidly when crude moves up and reduce them more slowly after crude falls, so consumer relief may take longer than the market decline. Scenario 2 is a grinding blockade. Iranian oil exports remain constrained. Attacks occur intermittently. Most Gulf producers continue moving some cargo, and there is no catastrophic infrastructure damage. This is probably the environment in which oil remains volatile in a higher range rather than exploding continuously upward. Gasoline could move above $4 nationally. Diesel would keep pressure on freight and agriculture. Airlines would face weaker margins, and the Fed would become more cautious about easing. Energy producers would benefit, but their stocks could still fall on days when diplomacy appears promising. Scenario 3 is the tail risk. Attacks materially reduce non-Iranian exports, major terminals or pipelines are damaged, crews refuse transit, insurers withdraw meaningful coverage, or the conflict expands toward other choke points. In that case, the market would stop pricing a blockade of Iranian ports and start pricing a regional supply emergency. Oil above $100 would become much more plausible. Gasoline could rise sharply, diesel and jet fuel might experience even greater stress, inflation expectations could move higher, and broader equities could sell off as investors price slower growth alongside higher prices. That combination is stagflationary, and it gives the Fed its least comfortable choice: protect growth or protect price stability. The Federal Reserve's July monetary policy report already acknowledged that the Middle East conflict had pushed energy inflation sharply higher, while officials warned that a prolonged oil shock could influence food, other goods, financial conditions, and inflation expectations. Vice Chair Philip Jefferson also pointed out an important counterweight on July 16th. Because America is now a net oil exporter and uses less oil per unit of economic output than in previous decades, the damage to aggregate U.S. demand may be smaller than in the past. That is reassuring at the national level, but it does not erase the distributional impact. Energy-producing states may gain jobs, investment, tax revenue, and corporate profits while commuting households, renters, small businesses, airlines, and low-income consumers lose purchasing power. The country can look more resilient in the data while millions of individual budgets deteriorate. What should an investor do with that uncertainty? Start with position size, not prediction. If one geopolitical headline can destroy your financial plan, the position was too large before the headline arrived. Avoid transforming a diversified portfolio into a referendum on one shipping lane. Broad index investors already own energy companies. Before adding more, check how much exposure you have through retirement accounts, sector funds, commodity funds, employer stock, and local employment. A petroleum engineer in Houston whose income and home value already depend on energy does not have the same diversification needs as a nurse in Boston. An airline employee buying a small energy allocation may be hedging part of an employment risk. Context changes. The meaning of the same investment. Next, separate money needed soon from money invested for long-term growth. Cash required for rent, tuition, taxes, a down payment, or an emergency should not be placed in a volatile oil trade because the headline looks obvious. Short-term treasury securities or insured cash may offer stability for near-term obligations, while diversified equities remain a long-term tool. Inflation-protected treasury securities can provide exposure to changes in measured inflation, but they fluctuate with real interest rates and are not a perfect hedge for your personal grocery or gasoline bill. Energy stocks can hedge an oil shock imperfectly, but they introduce company risk, valuation risk, political risk, and the possibility that oil falls before earnings capture the spike. There is no single asset that perfectly protects every household from this chain reaction. Rebalancing is usually more disciplined than chasing. If energy holdings surge and become an oversized portion of your portfolio, trimming back toward a planned allocation can turn volatility into a systematic decision. If the broader market declines while your long-term financial position remains secure, regular contributions can purchase diversified assets at lower prices. The goal is not to predict every missile, negotiation, or presidential announcement. The goal is to build a structure that survives being wrong. For households, calculate your fuel sensitivity tonight. Take the gallons your family uses in an average month and multiply that number by 25 cents, 50 cents, and $1. Those are 3 stress test amounts. If you consume 60 gallons, a 50-cent increase is $30 per month. If a 2-car household consumes 120 gallons, the same increase is $60. Add possible increases in delivery costs, airfare, utilities, and groceries. Then decide where that money would come from before it arrives. That exercise is more useful than arguing about whether oil will be $92 or $97 next Tuesday. Combine errands, maintain tire pressure, remove unnecessary vehicle weight, compare stations along routes you already travel, and avoid driving several miles merely to save 2 cents per gallon. If your employer offers flexible scheduling or occasional remote work, the savings may be meaningful. Do not hoard gasoline. It is dangerous, ties up cash, and usually solves nothing. Grocery planning matters as well. Compare unit prices rather than package prices, build meals around flexible ingredients, reduce waste, freeze food before it spoils, and watch products with heavy transportation, refrigeration, or packaging exposure. Panic buying transfers money from your emergency fund into a closet full of items you may not use. A strong household response is boring. Preserve cash, reduce waste, maintain flexibility, and avoid expensive debt. If you carry variable rate balances, remember that the oil shock can affect you twice. Once through living costs, and again if inflation keeps borrowing rates elevated. Paying down high-interest debt can produce a more dependable benefit than speculating on which producer will win the blockade. Small business owners should run the same scenario analysis. What percentage of costs depends on fuel or freight? Can deliveries be consolidated? Do customer contracts allow a transparent fuel surcharge? Are suppliers offering fixed pricing? Or are you unknowingly accepting unlimited cost exposure? Could a modest inventory buffer protect operations? Or would it trap working capital in goods that may fall in price after de-escalation? Sophisticated commodity hedging can be useful for companies with genuine exposure, but derivatives are not a casual solution. The contract size, basis risk, margin requirements, accounting treatment, and timing can create losses even when the broad economic idea is correct, so professional guidance matters. Here is the dashboard I would watch. Number 1. Actual tanker traffic through Hormuz, not speeches. Number 2. Confirmed attacks and whether crews or insurers withdraw. Number 3. Brent crude, because it is more relevant to U.S. gasoline than many Americans realize. Number 4. Wholesale gasoline and diesel margins, because crude can remain stable while refined fuels rise. Number 5. U.S. crude and product inventories. Number 6. Refinery outages and utilization. Number 7. Long-term inflation. Expectations and Treasury yields. Number 8. Language from the Fed about second-round effects. Number 9. Whether Gulf bypass pipelines increase flows. Number 10. Whether the blockade remains limited to Iranian ports or begins interfering materially with non-Iranian cargo. If those indicators improve together, the oil premium can disappear faster than fear-driven buyers expect. If they deteriorate together, the pain can spread beyond energy stocks into consumer spending, credit, housing, transportation, and employment. One final detail reveals how quickly forecasts can become obsolete. On July 7th, the EIA projected that U.S. gasoline would average roughly $3.60 in the second half of 2026 and that Brent would average $74 in the third quarter. But that forecast was completed on July 1st, before the renewed blockade announcement and the latest escalation. That does not make the EIA careless. It demonstrates the limitation of every forecast. A model can be excellent and still be overwhelmed by new facts. Treat forecasts as conditional roadmaps, not promises. If Hormuz traffic normalizes, the EIA's lower price direction could reassert itself. If the blockade deepens, those assumptions must be revised. The most shocking outcome may not be $5 gasoline or an oil stock doubling. It may be that the abandoned 20% fee barely matters compared with the invisible charge already created by fear. The official toll was replaced after one day. The risk premium remained. Every tanker delayed, every insurer demanding more money, every refinery paying for scarcer crude, every truck filling with expensive diesel, and every family cutting another item from the budget is paying some portion of that invisible toll. Watch duration. Watch physical supply. Protect your liquidity. Refuse to confuse a dramatic story with a guaranteed investment return. Oil shocks reward preparation and punish certainty, and the people most likely to survive this one will not be those who guessed the loudest number. They will be the ones who built a plan that still works if crude rises, falls, or changes direction before the next headline appears.